The hallway ended where it shouldn't have. I knew that sounds like the sort of sentence people use when they want to make you lean in, but I'm telling you exactly what happened. I had walked that corridor less than a minute earlier. I knew how many doors it had, where the old crash cart was tipped against the wall, where the paint had bubbled in a hand-shaped patch from the damp. Then I turned a corner I had already turned once that night, and there was nothing there except a flat wall painted the same dead government green as the rest of the hospital. My flashlight beam shook over it, not because I was panicking, because the air had gone cold so fast it made my fingers stiff. Everything in that place was damp, salt-heavy, sticky with condensation, but this was different. This felt dry, sealed, like the air had been shut up for years and didn't want me breathing it. I put my hand on the wall. 10 seconds earlier, it had been a door. From the other side, something knocked, slow, measured, not pounding for help, not random. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more, like whoever was in there knew I'd stay if they gave me time to listen. Then a voice came through the metal and paint soft enough that I had to lean close to hear it. Colton? Not the name on my badge, my real name. The knocking stopped, and the voice asked, calm as a man waking from sleep, "Why'd you leave me there?" I need to go back to the beginning. The job was 12 miles north of Port Orford, on a strip of coast where the road narrowed and the trees leaned inland as if even they were tired of the wind. Blackwater Station Hospital sat alone on a bluff above the Pacific, not close enough to the cliff edge to look dramatic, just far enough back to seem permanent. That was somehow worse. If a building looked unstable, at least you knew what kind of danger you were dealing with. Blackwater looked anchored, deliberate. It had the long, low shape of a military facility built to outlast the people inside it. I got there just before dusk. The sky was the color of wet cement. The ocean below the bluff made that constant dragging sound against the rocks, like somebody slowly pulling heavy fabric across concrete. The air smelled of salt and rust and something sharper under it, something medicinal that had sunk so deep into the walls it was still there years after the place had been abandoned. I sat in my car for a minute longer than I needed to, staring at the building through the windshield and telling myself that empty institutions all looked the same after dark. Same blank windows, same service entrances, same security lights throwing more shadow than illumination. That wasn't true, of course. I knew exactly why places like that got under my skin. I just wasn't ready to say it out loud, even to myself. I had taken the job under a false name. The posting was cash-heavy, immediate start, overnight only. That alone told me it wasn't a good job. Good jobs ask questions. Good jobs do background checks. Good jobs don't put a decommissioned hospital at the end of a cliff road and tell you all you need to do is keep an eye on it until redevelopment goes through. But I needed distance. I needed the kind you could measure in states crossed and phone calls not returned. In Oregon was far enough from Nevada that I could pretend I had started over. The man who met me at the main entrance introduced himself as Douglas Ivor Hale. He was in his late 50s, maybe older, with a heavy rain jacket zipped all the way to his chin and a face that always looked like he had just remembered something unpleasant. He didn't offer a handshake. He looked past me at my car, then at the road behind it, as if checking whether I'd brought somebody with me. "You came alone," he said. "That was the job description." He didn't smile. "Right?" The front lobby doors stuck when he pushed them open. The rubber seals made a wet, sucking sound. Inside, the air was colder than outside, and still. Not truly still, because there was a hum under everything, low and constant, faint enough that I couldn't place it at first. Not generators, not ventilation. More like old machinery holding a note in another part of the building. The sound ran through the floor and up my shins. Douglas saw me listening. "You'll hear that all night, ignore it." "What is it?" He shrugged. "Inactive systems, residual draw. Ocean wind in the utility runs, depends who you ask." Depends who you ask. That should have stood out more than it did. The lobby had a main security desk facing a bank of dark monitors. Behind it, hallways branched into 3 wings. A faded directory on the wall still used military terminology for some departments. Triage, surgical, records, long-term observation. The lettering had been scraped off one section hard enough to score the paint beneath it. A metal fire door at the far end of the right corridor had a sheet of plywood bolted across it from the outside. Someone had spray-painted Ward C on the plywood in white block letters. Douglas followed my eyes, then looked away too quickly. "That wing's sealed," he said. "You don't need it for patrol." "Why's it sealed?" "Because it's not on your route." He said it flatly, and that was the end of that. He gave me the kind of briefing men give when they don't want to answer questions, but also don't want to look like they're hiding anything. The ground's fence was broken in 2 places. Contractors had left salvageable equipment in storage rooms on the 2nd floor. Local kids had tried getting in a few times last summer, but not lately. My patrol was the lobby, 1st floor east and west, then 2nd floor, then back down again. In no basement, no roof access. Radio check every hour on the hour. If I saw anybody, I called him and stayed visible, no heroics. Then he slid a clipboard toward me and told me to sign. That was when I saw the typed sheet taped to the desk under the plastic cover. It wasn't on the clipboard. It wasn't in any employee packet. Just a single page, center-aligned with no letterhead. Like somebody had typed it up for themselves and decided not to explain. I read it there while Douglas pretended to untangle a ring of keys. "Do not enter Ward C after 1:10 in the morning. If you hear knocking inside sealed rooms, report it and do not respond. All doors that close behind you will reopen within 30 seconds. Remain on your assigned floor unless instructed otherwise." I read the page twice. Then I looked at Douglas. "And what's this?" He glanced down at it, and for the first time that evening I saw something move in his face. Not surprise, recognition. The kind you get when a thing you hope nobody would mention gets named in front of you anyway. "House rules," he said. "For an empty hospital? For this one." He said it in a tone that invited me to laugh it off and leave it alone. I almost did. I wanted the money. I wanted uncomplicated. I wanted a night of locked doors and ocean wind and maybe a raccoon in the dumpsters. Instead, I tapped the line about doors reopening. That one sounds oddly specific. The doors swell in the damp. Some latch, some don't. If one sticks, give it a few seconds. Pressure equalizes. And the knocking. Old pipes, shift noise, this place settles. "And Ward C?" He picked up the keys. Sealed means sealed. That was the entire answer. Looking back, that was the first moment the night split in 2 for me. In one version, I should have walked out right then. In the other, the version I lived, I nodded like he had explained enough. Clipped on the borrowed badge with the false name and told myself weird rules were better than no rules at all. Douglas led me through the 1st floor fast, like a man walking through a room where an argument had happened earlier and might happen again. The hospital had been stripped but not cleaned. Beds were gone, monitors gone, cabinets hanging open. Yet the place still carried traces of use. Sticky condensation filmed the handrails. Rust bled from screw heads and narrow orange tears. The smell of antiseptic clung under the salt, stale but unmistakable, and as if the walls themselves had been disinfected so many times they'd learned the scent. My assigned floor was the first, at least officially. He said I could make 2nd floor checks because the camera coverage up there was dead, but my base was downstairs. He repeated that word, assigned, in a way that made me think of barracks, not employment. When we passed the blocked entrance to Ward C, he didn't slow down. I did. I couldn't help it. The plywood had warped from the damp, and there were rust streaks beneath the bolts. I thought I heard something from the other side. Not a voice, just a pressure shift. The kind of small sound sealed spaces make when temperature changes inside them. Douglas was already halfway down the corridor when he noticed I'd stopped. "Mr. Rivas." That was the fake name. I turned. "You stay on your route," he said. By the time he left, the light outside had gone from gray to black. The last of the day sank into the windows and disappeared. I locked the front doors, did my first radio check, and stood alone behind the security desk with the typed rules under my hand and the low hum of the building in my bones. I kept telling myself I knew this kind of place. That was the problem. The first hour almost reassured me. The hospital was empty in the ordinary ways. Water clicked somewhere in the walls. A loose blind tapped softly against a window frame in an office overlooking the west lot. My boots squeaked on old tile where the condensation was thickest. The flashlight made everything look flatter than it was, all depth lost in glare and shadow. I checked stairwells, supply rooms, the loading entrance, in the old nurse stations. Nothing moved except a moth trapped behind a yellowed plexiglass panel in the west corridor. When I leaned close, I could hear its wings ticking. I remember feeling calmer then, embarrassingly calm. Like the rules were theater put up by somebody who'd spent too many nights alone in an empty building and needed structure more than protection. I even started timing my route against the ocean wind, counting the few seconds it took for the sound of a stronger gust to reach the windows on the north side. Then I opened a door to the old records hall on the first floor east wing. The handle was slick with cold moisture. I stepped through, heard the latch catch behind me, and turned automatically to pull it back open. It didn't move. I wasn't alarmed. Not at first. I thought of the typed sheet, and the line about 30 seconds, and almost laughed. Fine, I thought. Pressure equalization, swollen frame, old building. I checked my watch and waited. The hall beyond was narrow with rows of closed office doors and a scatter of file folders swollen to lumps on the floor. The air smelled stronger there, more chemical than salt. Under the hum, I heard a faint dripping. Too regular to be plumbing and too soft to locate. My breath clouded briefly in front of me. That made me pause. The corridor wasn't cold enough for that, not really. Damp, yes. Chilled, yes, but not breath-fogging cold. I looked down the hall. Nothing. At exactly 30 seconds, the latch clicked. The door opened 2 inches on its own. I remember smiling at that. Actually smiling. Because for one stupid, comforting second, it felt like proof. And whatever else was odd about Blackwater, at least it was predictably odd. I pushed the door wider and stepped back through. I stopped so fast my knees hurt. It wasn't the lobby corridor outside. It was another hallway. Same width, same institutional paint, but lined with shuttered patient rooms I had not seen before. A gurney lay on its side halfway down, one wheel spinning slowly, though there was no breeze. The directory placard on the wall had water damage darkening half the text. And on the floor near the baseboard where the condensation had pooled, a patch of fogged breath hung low in the beam of my flashlight, as if someone standing there had exhaled and then vanished. I didn't move for a few seconds. I told myself I had gotten turned around, that there were service connectors Douglas hadn't shown me, that old hospitals were repetitive by design and I was seeing patterns where there weren't any. All rational thoughts, all useful, none of them enough. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Not loud, rubber-soled, measured, exactly the pace I'd been walking a moment earlier. I turned. No one there, only the door standing open behind me, leading back into the records hall. I shut it, counted to 30, opened it again. The lobby corridor was back. That was the first loop. I started timing every door after that, not because I was afraid yet, because I wanted data, something to pin the place down with. I wrote down the seconds in the margin of the patrol sheet, 29, 31, 30 exactly. The first floor west utility room took 32 the first time, then 28 the next. And the old treatment annex took 30 on the nose 3 times in a row, which bothered me more than variance would have. Buildings decay irregularly. Precision belongs to machinery, not rot. The hum followed me everywhere. Sometimes I felt it through the railing before I heard it. Sometimes it faded near intersections, then returned stronger when I chose a direction which I told myself was just acoustics. The salt smell came and went with it. In some halls, the air tasted metallic, like I'd bitten the inside of my cheek. Near midnight on the second floor, I found a door that reopened onto the same room I'd just left, but with the furniture shifted 6 inches to the left. That sounds impossible because it is. I know what I saw. I also know how ridiculous it sounds said aloud. So let me be precise. It was an old break room, sink, counter, a vending machine dead in the corner, metal table with 2 plastic chairs. I checked it once while moving clockwise through the floor. 1 chair was tucked in. 1 was angled out. There was a coffee ring on the table shaped like a crescent moon. I closed the door, counted to 30, reopened it, and the chair that had been tucked in was now angled, and the crescent stain had become a full circle, darker, as if the cup that made it had sat there longer. No sound, no movement. Just a room disagreeing with its earlier self. That was when the calm started to crack. Not all at once. It was subtler than that. A hairline split in the part of my mind that keeps the world sorted into possible and impossible. I kept walking. I kept timing doors. I kept making hourly radio checks to Douglas, who answered in the same flat voice each time. He never asking whether anything was wrong, just telling me to continue patrol. Once I asked him how long the previous guard had lasted. There was a pause on the radio. Hiss, then stay on your route. That was the only answer. A little after midnight, I went looking for a bathroom because I wanted fluorescent light and a mirror and something ordinary enough to reset my nerves. I found one near the central stairwell. The mirror was clouded with age, but it worked. I washed my hands in water so cold it made my fingers ache. When I looked up, there was fog on the glass near my left shoulder, the shape of breath from somebody standing close behind me. I spun around. Empty room. When I turned back, the fog had already thinned. I know now that was the moment I should have left. Instead, I dried my hands on my pants. I told myself old pipes vent strange. Told myself stress can make normal things feel staged, and went back out into the corridor where the hum was waiting like it had never stopped. On my next round past the first floor locker room, I noticed one of the metal lockers standing open by an inch. I was sure it had been closed earlier. Maybe not locked, but closed. The cold in that room was worse than the hall outside. The damp there wasn't just on the surfaces. It felt suspended in the air itself, tiny, sticky grains settling on my face. There was no reason to check the locker except that by then every small irregularity felt connected. Inside was an old rain jacket, a flashlight with corroded batteries, and a folded page of notebook paper tucked into a knit cap. Not typed, handwritten, no signature. I unfolded it under my flashlight, and the ink had bled at the edges from moisture, but I could still read it. Ward C is the only safe place after 1:10 in the morning. If knocking stops, you waited too long. Doors that reopen are not the same doors. Never stay on the same floor for more than 10 minutes. I read those lines once, then again. I stood there listening to the hum in the walls and the sea dragging itself against the rocks outside and realized something that was somehow more frightening than the rules themselves. Both sets sounded like they had been written by somebody trying to help. That was the contradiction that got inside me. Not that one set had to be true and the other false. It was that both of them might be true at different times under different conditions, in different versions of the building, and if that was the case, and then the real danger wasn't ignorance, it was being 1 minute late to the wrong reality. I didn't test the handwritten note right away. I'd like to tell you I was cautious. The truth is, I was afraid of confirming it. A weird building you can manage. Weird instructions that start proving themselves one by one, that's something else. Still, the line about staying on the same floor needled at me. I had already spent longer than 10 minutes in several places. Nothing obvious had happened. Then again, maybe something had, and I had mistaken it for drafts or bad acoustics or nerves. So I tried something controlled. A little after 12:30, I planted myself in the first floor west corridor outside an old treatment room and waited. I checked my watch. I counted breaths. I listened. At first there was nothing except the hum on the distant ocean and the tiny clicking sounds buildings make when the night temperature shifts. The antiseptic smell was stronger there, undercut by mildew from the soaked ceiling tiles. Condensation gathered on the wall beside me and ran in narrow lines that looked almost deliberate, too evenly spaced to be random. I kept my flashlight off for part of it just to hear better. At 9 minutes, I started feeling stupid. At 10, nothing changed. At 10 minutes and maybe 15 seconds, a knock sounded from inside the treatment room door beside me. Just one. Soft. I froze. Another came, then another, evenly spaced. I put my ear to the door before I could stop myself. The metal was so cold it hurt. No voices, no scraping, just that patient knocking from the other side, as if someone shut in there had all the time in the world. And the typed rule said report it and do not respond. The handwritten note said if knocking stops, you waited too long. I backed away from the door and called Douglas on the radio. It crackled twice before he answered. I've got knocking inside a sealed room. Silence. Then, location. First floor west, treatment corridor. Another pause. Long enough that I thought he'd gone off signal. Then he said, do not answer it. I wasn't planning to. Stay where you are. That should have reassured me. Instead, it did the opposite. Stay where you are. Official Rule 4. Remain on your assigned floor unless instructed otherwise. The handwritten note in my pocket felt suddenly heavier than the radio in my hand. The knocking kept going. Same measured rhythm. I glanced at my watch again and realized I had been on the first floor nearly 12 minutes straight. A thought came to me so fast it barely felt like my own. Not leave. Move. I took the stairwell to the second floor. The instant my foot hit the landing above, the knocking below stopped. Not faded. Stopped. I stood there with one hand on the rail, listening hard enough that my jaw hurt. The stairwell smelled like wet concrete and old wiring. My own breathing sounded too loud. After a few seconds, the hum returned, low and ordinary, and with it came a rush of cold relief so sharp it almost made me laugh. Then my radio clicked alive. Why'd you leave your floor? Douglas asked. His voice wasn't angry, it was scared. I looked down at the radio. You told me to stay there. I told you to report it. I did, Static hissed. Then, eat quieter. If you moved before it stopped, that's good. The word sat there between us, before it stopped. Not if, not what stopped. As if we both knew. I pressed the talk button. What exactly am I dealing with here? No answer. I repeated it. Still nothing. When I came back down a minute later, the treatment room door was standing open. The room beyond was empty except for a bed frame bolted to the floor and 4 deep scratches in the condensation on the far wall, parallel and fresh like somebody had dragged their fingernails through wet frost. I found Maris Velt an hour later, though saying I found her suggests a cleaner event than it was. I heard my footsteps continue after I stopped walking. That happened in the second floor surgical wing. The halls up there were wider, and with observation windows clouded from the inside and heavy double doors between sections that took longer to reopen than the others. I had just passed a dark nurse station when the sound of my own steps kept going ahead of me. Same pace. Same rubber drag on tile. I stopped dead. The footsteps took 3 more steps and stopped too, somewhere just beyond the bend. I didn't call out right away. My mouth had gone dry. The air there carried a stale heat under the cold damp, like machinery that had once run hot was still slowly bleeding it off through the walls. Then a woman said from around the corner, "Don't take the left hall, it seals first." Her voice was hoarse, matter of fact, like we were co-workers avoiding a wet floor, and I moved carefully to the intersection and found her sitting on the edge of an overturned supply cart with a flashlight across her knees. She wore an old security jacket with a patch shadow where a name strip had been removed. Her hair was tied back badly as if she'd done it in the dark. She looked around my age, maybe a little older, but there was something off about the way she held herself. Tired wasn't enough. She had the posture of somebody conserving energy because she'd already learned where panic gets spent. For a second, I thought she was a trespasser. Then I saw the key ring at her belt. "Who are you?" I asked. She looked me over, badge and all, and frowned in a way that made me feel like she recognized me from somewhere I hadn't been. "Maris," she said. "Or I was. Last time it mattered." "Your security?" "Was." The hum in the walls deepened, then thinned again. She tilted her head as if listening to a conversation at a distance. "You're not supposed to be up here yet," she said. That snagged on me. "Yet?" She ignored the question. Her eyes moved to the corridor behind me. "Did Hale tell you to avoid Ward C after 110? I stared at her. "How'd you know that?" "Because he always does. Always." She looked back at me then, and there was something like pity in her face. "You haven't read the locker note?" I didn't answer. That seemed to tell her enough. She stood, slow and careful, and I saw then that one leg of her pants was dark with old blood down the shin. Not fresh. Brown-black dried into the fabric. She caught me looking and gave a little shrug. "And that hasn't happened yet for you," she said. "Sorry, I keep mixing the order up. There are sentences that sound strange and sentences that sound wrong in a deeper way, wrong in structure, like hearing somebody remember tomorrow. Hers was the second kind. My first instinct was concussion, psychotic break, transient intruder. Every explanation I could reach for was human because the alternative wasn't manageable. "You work for Hale?" I asked. She smiled without humor. "Not anymore." "Then how are you in here?" She glanced toward the stairwell. "Same as you. Took the wrong job when I needed money." That landed harder than it should have, not because it was surprising, because of how plainly she said it. No self-pity, no performance, just fact. I felt absurdly like she'd stepped too close to a part of me I had kept turned inward. How long have you been here?" I asked. She answered, "Depends which part you mean." I didn't know what to do with that. I wish I could say I was immediately afraid of her, but I wasn't. I was relieved. Another person meant friction against the unreality of the place. Another witness. Another set of senses. Even with the wrongness hanging off her words, she made the hospital feel less solitary for about 10 seconds. Then she said, "When the wall talks, don't let it finish." Something tightened in my chest. "What wall?" She blinked, as if surprised by my question. "The one at the end of the hall. I thought you already heard it by now." I felt the cold damp on the back of my neck. "Heard what?" She studied me, really studied me. Then her expression changed, not to fear exactly, but to recognition. "Oh," she said softly, "and you're earlier than I thought." Before I could ask what that meant, a door farther down the surgical wing clicked open by itself, not wide, just enough to show darkness beyond. Maris looked toward it and went still. "Don't use that one," she said. "Why?" "Because it doesn't open where you left it." I almost laughed because I had already learned that much, and hearing her say it should have been confirmation. Instead, it felt like being told my private thoughts had been written down somewhere ahead of me. She started backing toward the opposite corridor. "Wait," I said, "not Maris. Did Hale say you'd quit?" That stopped her. Slowly, she turned back. The fluorescent emergency strip above us buzzed once, and for a split second the light changed. Not flickered, changed. In one version of that second, she stood there in the dusty corridor with a dried blood stain on her pant leg. In the other, the hallway around her was darker, more decayed. The paint peeled almost to concrete, and Maris herself looked thinner, paler, with a fresh gash along her forehead glistening wetly down her temple. Then the ordinary corridor returned. I must have shown something in my face because she nodded once grimly. "Yeah," she said. "That starts soon, too." She left before I could stop her. One step back, then two, then she turned the corner and was gone. I ran after her within seconds. There was nowhere she could have gone without making noise. No doors opening, no stairwell slam, no scrape of boots, nothing. Only the hum, the damp, and the echo of my own breathing. That was the last normal conversation I had. After that, everything started arriving twice. There was the version I lived in while it happened, where each event still seemed capable of explanation if I could just get enough of them together. And there was the version I understand now, where the hospital had already begun fitting itself around me the way water takes the shape of a container. At 1 in the morning, Douglas finally came back on the radio long enough to say, "If you're near Central, avoid East Hall until 1:15. No explanation, no context. Why? Silence. Then, "Did you meet anyone tonight?" The question hit me wrong. Too quick, too casual. "I met a woman named Maris." Static swallowed the line for a few seconds. When he returned, his voice had lost what little patience it had carried before. There is no one else on site. I just spoke to her. Stay away from Ward C." The radio went dead. At 1:08, the first floor changed. I was near the main desk when I noticed the condensation on the floor drawing itself into lines not flowing but gathering in seams that hadn't been visible before. The hum deepened until it felt more like pressure than sound. Somewhere in the west wing, a door slammed. Then another. Then every monitor at the security desk flickered to life at once in a wash of static gray. Each screen showed an empty corridor. Not the same corridor. Different ones. First floor west, second floor central. A stairwell I hadn't used. The blocked entrance to Ward C. On one screen, for less than a second, I saw a man standing at the far end of a hall with his back to the camera. Security jacket. Hands hanging loose at his sides. Then the image tore sideways in static and vanished. I leaned closer. The smell from the desk was wrong, too sharp, like hot dust and antiseptic and old metal warming up. The typed rules under the plastic cover had gone damp at the edges. Without really deciding to, I pulled the handwritten note from my pocket and laid them side by side. "Do not enter Ward C after 1:10 in the morning. Ward C is the only safe place after 1:10 in the morning. Remain on your assigned floor unless instructed otherwise. Never stay on the same floor for more than 10 minutes. All doors that close behind you will reopen within 30 seconds. Doors that reopen are not the same doors. They weren't opposites. Not exactly. They were instructions for navigating two different conditions, in maybe two different states of the building. One said if the hospital was still behaving like a place. One said if it had begun behaving like something else. At 1:10 exactly, every monitor went black. The hum stopped. The silence that followed wasn't ordinary silence. It had weight. It pressed at my ears. I could hear the blood in my own neck, the distant surf outside, and then from the first floor east corridor, a single knock. I should have stayed at the desk. I know that. But the thing about contradiction is that it makes every choice feel like proof of your own stupidity. If I stayed and that was wrong, I was trapped. If I moved and that was wrong, same result. My watch read 1:10. The handwritten note burned in my pocket. Ward C is the only safe place after 1:10 in the morning. I took one step toward the East Hall, and the corridor lights dimmed together, not out, just lower, enough to make every far doorway look deeper than it was. Then the knocking came again. Not from the East Hall this time, from behind me. I turned. The lobby entrance was gone. Not dark, not obscured. Gone. In its place was a flat painted wall. My throat closed. For one blind second I was somewhere else entirely, somewhere hot and airless with metal around me and the taste of dust in my teeth, hearing somebody on the other side of a sealed barrier call my name in a voice getting weaker by the minute. I shoved that memory down so hard it almost made me stagger. The wall behind the desk knocked 3 times. I backed away. The condensation on the countertop had gone glassy with cold. My flashlight beam jittered over the painted surface, and over the seams that should have been a door and weren't. Then the voice came through it, muffled, intimate, patient. Colton. My real name, not the false one, not the one on the badge. Why'd you leave me there? I don't know if my answer came out loud or only in my head. I know I said no. The voice continued, calm as ever. You said you'd be right back. The exact words my partner had used before the radio cut into static in that maintenance shaft back in Nevada. Not close to them, not similar, exact. Until then, I had lived inside a sealed compartment of my own making. I had told the story one way on paper and another way in my head and never let them touch. Structural failure, bad luck, panic, delay. Things happen fast. You freeze. You make one wrong call and then 10 smaller ones trying to survive the first. And there are ways to arrange the truth so you can still get up in the morning. That voice took all that arrangement and broke it open. I moved without thinking, not toward the wall, away from it, toward the central stairwell. Behind me, the knocking started again, faster now, still measured but with a tightening urgency that made the skin on my back crawl. The official rule said, stay on your assigned floor. The handwritten one said, never stay on the same floor for more than 10 minutes. I hit the stairwell door. It shut behind me with a hard metal bang that sent a shock through the railings, and did not reopen. My lungs stopped working for a second. The stairwell was colder than the lobby, damp running down the cinder block in chilled threads. Somewhere below, maybe from the basement level I hadn't been shown, I heard another door slam. Then from the wall beside me came a soft, impossible sound. Knocking, inside the concrete, not loud, just there. If knocking stops, you waited too long. I ran up, first landing, second. The hum returned in pulses, stronger with each flight. Halfway to the second floor, the lights changed color, not brighter or dimmer, just older somehow, their white, gone nicotine yellow. The paint on the walls peeled more heavily, water stains spread like bruises across the ceiling. I pushed into the corridor and almost went down because the layout wasn't the same anymore. The nurse station had shifted. The hall that should have led to surgical recovery now bent sharply right into a narrow passage lined with closed metal shutters. Each one was numbered. Each one had a viewing slit blackened from the other side. At the far end, a sign hung crooked on a chain. Ward C. The official rule and the handwritten note stood in my head side by side, equally clear, equally possible. Don't enter. Only safe place. Don't enter. Only safe place. Behind me, through the stairwell wall, the voice spoke again. This time it said something I had never told anyone. Not the police, not the insurance people, not the coroner, not myself out loud in an empty room. I'm scared to go to sleep in here, Colton. That had been the last thing he said before the signal dropped. The hallway in front of me felt suddenly like the inside of a throat. Damp, narrow, waiting. I could smell rust and salt and old disinfectant so strongly it coated the back of my tongue. The condensation on the metal shutters was sticky and cold under my fingertips. I went into Ward C. Nothing dramatic happened at first. No lights bursting, no door slamming, just a change in pressure, like stepping into a room that had been sealed and then opened a fraction. The knocking behind me dulled, not stopped, dulled. As if distance in that place had nothing to do with feet or walls and everything to do with what set of rules you had chosen. That was how I escaped the first seal, but the hospital did not put itself back afterward. When I came out of Ward C some time later, the corridor outside no longer matched the second floor I had climbed to. The nurse station was gone. In its place stood a row of patient doors with small wired glass panes. One had a handprint on the inside, clear in the condensation. I didn't see the hand move. I saw that it had been there a second ago and was not there now. By 2 in the morning, I had stopped believing the hospital was merely changing. It was selecting. Rooms began arriving in pairs. I would enter an office and find it stripped dry, mostly intact, file cabinets tagged for transfer. I would back out, count to 30 because by then that had become reflex, and reopen the same door to find the same office in a more advanced state of ruin. Ceiling sagged, paint blackened with moisture. A medication chart still pinned to the wall, its corners furred with mold. The same room, but from farther down its own timeline. Maris appeared in both versions. Once she crossed the end of a hall ahead of me, unharmed, walking fast. One hand pressed to the radio at her shoulder as if she were listening to a transmission I couldn't hear. I chased her around the corner and found the corridor older, darker, and Maris leaning against the wall with blood fresh on her forehead, looking at me like she had been waiting a long time. "Told you not to take the left hall," she said. "I didn't." Her eyes narrowed. "Not yet, then." She was getting under my skin in the worst way because she kept talking like memory ran ahead of action. I couldn't decide whether she was manipulating me, warning me, or simply no longer anchored to sequence the way ordinary people are. Maybe all three. She knew things she shouldn't. She also seemed just as frightened of the building as I was, only more familiar with the shape of that fear. "What is this place?" I asked her once in a decayed treatment room where the walls sweated cold and the floor buckled under old water damage. She sat on the edge of a cabinet and listened to the hum before answering. "It's not one place." "That isn't an answer. It's the closest one." She studied the room around us, the cracked sink, the hanging privacy track with no curtain, the dull metal door at the far end with no handle on our side. "You keep thinking it's trapping you," she said. "That's why you keep looking for exits." "What should I be looking for?" Her mouth moved like she almost smiled. "The exchange." I didn't understand what she meant then, not fully. I understood enough to hate the word. The hospital kept giving me small proofs and then withdrawing them. On the second floor central hall, I found a nurse station logbook that recorded my radio check before I made it. The timestamp in the margin was 30 minutes ahead. On the next page, the ink was still wet around a line that read "Patrol delayed by SEAL event. A guard proceeding to Ward C." It wasn't my handwriting. It also wasn't anyone else's I recognized. When I touched it, the wet ink smeared onto my thumb. In the cleaner version of the hall, the book wasn't there at all. I started mapping the floor on the back of the patrol sheet. After 20 minutes, the map was useless. Corridors repeated in impossible sequences. Doors reopened onto halls I had already crossed from another angle. Twice I passed the same broken wheelchair under 2 different windows. One overlooking the west lot, one overlooking the ocean. The environment behaved consistently inside each moment, but those moments did not agree with one another. That was the rule beneath the rules. consistency without logic, a system that never broke its own behavior, only your understanding of where that behavior belonged. And sometime after 3, I found the main security office behind a door that had not been on the first floor earlier. The room smelled stale and papery, less damp than the rest of the building, as if it had spent years sealed. Metal cabinets lined one wall. An old monitor sat dead on the desk. Beside it was a stack of handwritten incident logs bound with a rubber band gone brittle with age. I almost didn't touch them. Then I saw the names. Not names I knew. Different guards across different years, maybe decades. Their entries started practical. Door malfunction in East Corridor, unexplained sound in sealed room. Supervisor unreachable for 6 minutes. Then gradually the language shifted. Route no longer matching posted plans. Knock heard from inside wall cavity. Subject claiming to be previous guard encountered near Ward C. Each set of notes ended the same way, more or less. Not with death. Not even with goodbye. With interruption. Sentences cut off. Pens dragged across paper. Final entries written harder, as if the act of recording had become urgent because time inside the building no longer moved cleanly enough to trust memory. And every final entry referenced replacement. Something like, "If this log is found, do not let the next man use my keyring." Or, "Hale says relief is on the way." There isn't relief, only succession. Or I heard her voice in the compartment before I ever met her. One line from a guard named Trammell made my hands go numb on the page. It doesn't hold you, it needs you to hear who's already inside. I turned the last bundle over and found the newest logbook beneath it. The cover was still dry, recent. Inside, and the first page had Douglas Ivor Hale's clipped block handwriting at the top, assigning overnight security coverage to a name I had never given him until that evening, my false one. Halfway down the next page, beneath a blank timestamp column, another name had begun to appear in darker, shakier strokes, as if written by a pen pressed through hesitation. Colton Reyes. Not complete. Just Colton Ray, then a downward drag of ink like the hand had been interrupted or no longer needed to finish because the building already knew the rest. As I stared at it, the wall clock above the filing cabinet ticked once. The minute hand jumped forward 4 minutes, then another 2, then stopped. The logbook page beneath my hand made a soft scratching sound. I jerked back. At the bottom of the page, and in fresh ink that had not been there a second earlier, a new line formed itself in cramped letters. Subject proceeding toward C at 1:10. My mouth went dry. My watch said 3:17. The page insisted on 1:10. Or maybe it wasn't insisting. Maybe it was describing another pass through the same pattern, another version of me arriving where I had already been. A drop of cold moisture landed on the back of my hand. Then another. I looked up. The ceiling above the desk wasn't leaking. The condensation was gathering into 3 round beads, evenly spaced, then falling one after another onto the metal surface. Tap, tap, tap. I backed out of the office so fast I hit the doorframe with my shoulder. The hum in the corridor had become almost musical, a long note with a vibration inside it that reminded me of a freight elevator straining under weight. The air smelled more strongly of sea salt than ever, as if the building had opened some hidden chamber to the cliffside and was letting the coast inside. That was when I finally understood something I should have understood from the start. The logs were not records of different kinds of incidents. They were records of the same incident wearing different names. By then, dawn still felt impossibly far away. I had lost the idea of how long I'd been moving through that place because time no longer behaved like a line. It folded, it repeated, it reached ahead and left evidence behind. But the clocks that still worked all drifted back toward 1:10 in the morning. Not exactly there, not all at once, but toward it. as if the hospital had a center of gravity in time and everything inside it eventually slid back into orbit around that minute. I found Maris again near the central stairwell. Or maybe she found me. She stood in the cleaner version of the corridor this time, jacket dry, forehead uninjured, looking at the security logbook in my hands before she looked at me. "You read them," she said. "How are there this many? Because they don't all happen first." I was too tired for her language by then, too raw. My voice came out harsher than I intended. "Talk like we're in the same world, Maris." She winced at that, not offended, just tired in a way that matched mine. "I'm trying." The stairwell door behind her was beaded with cold moisture. With every few breaths, a tiny mist of white appeared along its seam, and as if someone on the other side were breathing steadily into the crack. I pointed at it. "Do you see that?" Her gaze flicked there and away. "Don't open it." "Why?" "Because if the breath is visible, the room behind it isn't finished yet." I let that pass only because by then I had stopped expecting sentences from her to land in ordinary sense the first time. I held up the logbook. "My name is in this?" "Yeah." "You knew." "I knew you'd start seeing it." "No." "You knew me." For the first time, Maris looked honestly uncomfortable, not scared, cornered. "I knew your turn would line up with mine," she said. "What does that mean?" She rubbed her thumb along the edge of her flashlight. Small, nervous gesture. Human. I clung to it. "It means I heard you before you got here." The hum deepened. Somewhere far off, metal clanged. Maris continued, eyes not quite on me now. "Down in Ward C, before I ever saw your face, there was a compartment that kept knocking. Sometimes it used my name. Sometimes it used yours. Sometimes it said things I hadn't done yet." The cold in the corridor seemed to sharpen against my teeth. "There are people in those rooms?" "That's the wrong way to ask it." I laughed once. "Just air, no humor." "Then give me the right way." She met my eyes. "They hold whoever the building needs you to hear." That should have sent me running. Instead, it locked something in place, because it explained too much. The private words, my real name, the logs, the way the hospital kept shaping itself around sealed corridors and doors that changed after closing. It wasn't just random architecture preying on old fear. It was selecting the exact contour of it, rebuilding the one thing I had spent years trying not to walk back into. I thought of Nevada then, not in the soft, edited way I usually allowed myself, in fragments, dry heat trapped in concrete, the smell of machine grease and dust. My partner's voice over the radio, too calm at first because neither of us understood how badly the shift had jammed the hatch. The report I filed after, the minutes I deleted from my own account, the decision to leave the site and find help off record because if I called it in immediately, there'd be questions about why we'd bypassed the maintenance lockout procedure in the first place. Fear of charges, fear of prison, fear of losing everything. So I left him there. Not forever, I had told myself, just long enough to think. He died in the time I used to save myself, and I had never said that straight through before, even privately. The moment I admitted it to myself, even in silence, the lights over the corridor buzzed and dropped a notch lower. The hospital seemed to hear confession as clearly as speech. Maris watched my face and nodded once, as if something she had been waiting on had finally happened. "Yeah," she said quietly. "That's why it likes you." I hated her for that sentence. Because it was cruel. Because it was accurate. Because some part of me had already known the building wasn't choosing at random. "What is Ward C?" I asked. She looked toward the blocked wing, though we couldn't see it from there. "Where the overlap's strongest." "What overlap?" "The place where all the sealed versions meet." That was when every clock within sight snapped to 110, not gradually, instantly, in a wall clock above the stairwell. the dead monitor clock at the distant desk, my watch with its scratched face and cheap glow strip, all of them aligned on 1:10 in the morning as if the night had been reeled backward to its wound. Maris closed her eyes. "Too soon," she whispered. From somewhere below us, deep in the hospital, dozens of faint knocks began at once. Ward C was colder than the rest of the building, but not empty cold. Occupied cold, the kind that feels shaped by bodies no longer there. I got in through the blocked corridor because the plywood over the first-floor entrance was gone when we reached it, as if it had never been bolted there at all. The air beyond smelled of rust, salt spray, wet concrete, and an old sterile sharpness that took me straight back to utility shafts, maintenance bays, in-service corridors where everything important happened behind sealed access panels and no one stayed unless they had to. Maris didn't stop me from entering. She only said, "If you hear him, don't answer with what he wants." "What does he want?" She hesitated. "To know you mean it." That didn't make sense then. It does now. Ward C wasn't a patient wing in any ordinary form. It had been converted, or maybe repurposed after the fact, into a long row of narrow rooms built around sealed compartments set into the walls like oversized industrial lockers. Not hospital beds, not storage cabinets, compartment doors, thick, gasketed, each one with a recessed handle and a small square window covered from the inside by sliding metal plates. Some stood upright, some horizontal. A few were built floor to ceiling in paired columns. Every one of them had a number stenciled near the latch in old black paint. The geometry of the place made my skin crawl before I even understood why. The compartments were too much like maintenance access shafts, too much like crawl spaces and service tubes and emergency lock-ins. Places where air becomes an object. Places where time is measured by how hot the metal gets or how long a voice can keep sounding like itself through a closed hatch. From inside them came knocking. Not all at once, not in rhythm, faint, staggered, patient, one on the left, two farther down. Silence, then another from a compartment behind me. The sound was softened by layers of metal and wall, but unmistakable, human in its pattern, intentional. The low hum of the hospital was strongest there. It vibrated through the soles of my boots and into my knees. And the condensation on the compartment doors wasn't random. It had gathered where hands might press from the inside, where breath might warm the metal just enough to film it over. Some doors had names handwritten on old adhesive labels. Most were blank or peeled clean. Then my flashlight landed on one near the middle of the corridor and the air left my lungs. My partner's name was written there. Not a similar name, not partial, exact. The label looked old. The ink had bled slightly into the paper from damp. I moved closer because some stupid part of me thought proximity would disprove it. Maybe I was reading what I feared. Maybe the light was shaking too much, but no. It was there. The name I had seen in shift reports and payroll forms and emergency contact paperwork, and finally on the death certificate I didn't deserve to attend. And before I touched the compartment, something knocked from inside. 3 times. Slow. Familiar. I took a step back. A voice came through the metal, so faint I felt it more than heard it at first. "It's dark in here." My whole body went cold. I knew that line. He hadn't said it over the radio. He'd said it earlier when the emergency strip failed and we were trying to reset the maintenance panel. Just the two of us. No supervisor. No recording. I had never repeated it. I don't remember deciding to reach for the handle. I only remember Maris grabbing my wrist hard enough to hurt. "Don't," she said. Her face had changed again. Not injured. Older somehow. More exhausted. Like the act of getting to that moment had worn through several versions of her. "That's him," I said. Her grip tightened. "No, and that's what it built out of him." I stared at the compartment window cover. The damp label, the handle under my free hand. It knows things. Yeah, things no one knows. She gave a hollow laugh. You still think that's the test? Another knock sounded from farther down the ward. Then another. The whole corridor seemed to be waking by increments, each sealed compartment acknowledging the others. The sound wasn't frantic, it was administrative, like a process moving from station to station. I looked at Maris. Tell me what this is. She let go of my wrist. For a moment I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she leaned against the wall beside the compartment and said very softly, "It's a relay." The words settled into me with awful ease. She kept going. Not a trap, not exactly, more like a handoff. Places like this happen where enough sealed spaces line up around the same kind of leaving. Hospitals, ships, utility tunnels, quarantine units. Anywhere people decide someone can stay shut away a little longer if it buys time for the rest. The knocking around us seemed to listen. I thought Blackwater was doing it, she said. At first. Then I got farther in, saw other names in the logs, other sites, heard voices from places that weren't here. The hospital isn't the source. It's one station in it. Loop 2, not answered, only widened. I looked down the corridor of compartments and suddenly understood why every clock bent toward 110, why every rule had a mirror, why doors reopened onto altered rooms. It wasn't just a haunted building, it was an environment built to move someone from witness to participant, and to find the person already carrying the shape of abandonment and teach them how to occupy it. My voice came out thin. Why me? Maris's eyes flicked to the compartment with my partner's name, then back to me. Because you already know how to leave someone sealed and keep walking. Truth, when it lands clean, doesn't feel dramatic. It feels like a mechanism finding its notch. I leaned against the wall because my knees had started to shake. The metal was slick and cold under my shoulder. In the compartment beside us, someone tapped once from the inside, as if politely asking not to be forgotten. Maris said, "I tried every version of leaving. Early, late, with the rules against them, doesn't matter. It follows the same pattern." What pattern? It keeps one, releases one, needs the exchange witnessed. That was the choice, though she didn't name it yet. Stay and take the sealed place or leave while somebody else closed into it. My chest hurt. My partner's compartment knocked again. I wanted desperately to believe there was still a right action somewhere hidden under all that contradiction. Open the right door. Say the right thing. Refuse the premise. Break the system by not participating. But the hospital had already spent the whole night teaching me a more terrible lesson. That systems like this don't require belief, only position. Maris pushed off the wall and looked down the row as if checking addresses she already knew. "I'm ahead of you," she said. "That's why I kept talking wrong. I've had this conversation before. With me. Close enough." I hated how tired her voice sounded, hated that I believed her. "What happens if no one stays?" I asked. She shook her head. "I never saw that version." That silence between us stretched, knocking from all around, the hum in the floor, the ocean muffled somewhere beyond concrete and cliff. Salt sat heavy on my tongue. The air was so damp my shirt clung to my back, but my hands felt dry and numb. Then Maris did the one thing I had not prepared for. She walked to an empty compartment 3 doors down, placed her palm flat against the metal and said almost gently, "This one's mine." I moved after her. "No." She looked over her shoulder. "You can still leave." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got left." The compartment she had chosen looked no different from the others. Same thick door, same square-covered window, same recessed handle, no name on the label. And yet there was an intimacy to the way she touched it. Not affection exactly, but recognition. Like returning to a motel room she had already woken in too many times. "Maris," She turned fully then, and what I saw in her face wasn't resignation. That would have been easier. It was certainty mixed with pity, and beneath both something darker. Relief maybe, or the selfishness every sacrifice contains when it ends your own suspense. "I used to think staying meant saving the next person," she said. "Then I thought leaving might break it. Neither's clean, that's the point." That was the moral center of it, and it didn't arrive with thunder. It arrived with exhaustion. I understood in one rush exactly what the hospital had built for me. Not just fear, repetition. And it had taken the worst act of my life and narrowed the world until it came down to the same decision stripped of excuses. Walk away while someone else stays sealed, or close the door on yourself and call it justice, knowing nobody outside may ever know what you chose. If I left Maris there, I became what I had already been. Maybe worse, because this time I couldn't hide behind panic or uncertainty. If I stayed, I vanished into the mechanism, one more voice in a compartment waiting for the next desperate man to arrive and hear what only he could hear. There wasn't a right answer. That's why it worked. I stepped closer. "We can leave together." Maris's expression almost broke. "No, we can't. We haven't tried every way." She gave me a long look, and for a second I saw all the versions of her the hospital had shown me laid over one another. Injured, uninjured, frayed, calm, earlier, later. All of them carrying the same knowledge toward the same door. "I have," she said. Before I could grab her, she pulled the handle and stepped into the compartment. The interior light came on dimly, showing a narrow metal chamber no bigger than a standing coffin, gasket lining the frame, walls wet with condensation. She turned once inside it and faced me. Her hand stayed on the inner latch. "Maris, don't." She looked at me with something almost kind. "You already know what it costs to leave." Then she closed the door herself. The latch sealed with a soft, final clunk. I lunged for it, yanked the handle, pounded the metal, shouted her name. The door did not move. Even through the covered window came no sound at first. Then, very faintly, 3 knocks. Not frantic, patient. Behind me, my partner's compartment began knocking too. Then another. Then half the ward answering in staggered sequence. The corridor filled with it, a bureaucracy of the buried, a system confirming receipt. I stood there with my hand on Maris's door and understood that if I stayed, if I waited, if I gave in to the gravity of guilt and metal and enclosed air, the hospital would take that as consent. Maybe that would have been justice. Maybe it would have been surrender dressed as repair. I honestly don't know. I still don't. That's the part people want settled when I tell it, and I can't settle it for them. I backed away from her compartment. I hate myself a little every time I say that. But I did. I backed away while the knocking followed me down the ward. I turned once at the doorway and thought I saw in the row of compartment windows reflections of people standing inside places too narrow to live in. Not bodies, possibilities. Shapes made of condensation and waiting. One of them raised a hand to the glass. Then I ran. The route out was simpler than anything in Blackwater had a right to be. Ward C opened to the second-floor central hall. Central opened to the main stairwell. The stairwell descended without shifting. The first-floor lobby doors stood where they should have been. Glass black with the last of the night. It was as if the hospital, having secured one side of the exchange, no longer needed to confuse me into staying. Or maybe confusion had never been the point. The front doors opened on the first shove. Outside, and the pre-dawn air hit me hard with rain salt and cold wind off the Pacific. I stumbled to my car, hands shaking so badly I dropped the keys once on the gravel. Behind me, Blackwater Station Hospital stood dark against the paling sky, every window blind, every corridor hidden again behind brick and concrete and ordinary geometry. Nothing about the building from outside suggested what it held. That may be the worst part of any of this. How normal the shell can look once you're outside it. I drove south as dawn came up in strips of weak silver over the water. The coastline stayed in my rearview mirror for miles, cliff, trees, gray ocean, then road again. My clothes were still damp from the hospital. The car smelled like salt and cold metal and the stale coffee I'd spilled in the console 2 days earlier. I kept waiting for panic to hit, but what came instead was a deadened focus, the kind that follows surviving something your body hasn't filed yet. At some point after sunrise, I pulled into a turnout above the beach because my hands had started cramping on the wheel. The wind outside rocked the car gently. Gulls cried somewhere below. I put the vehicle in park and stared at the ocean until I could almost believe the world had gone back to scale. Then from behind me came 3 slow knocks. From inside the trunk. I didn't move. I didn't turn around. The sound came again, steady, measured, familiar enough that my mouth filled with that same old copper fear, not pounding, not trapped animal panic, just knocking, patient, certain I'd heard. There are things I could tell you to make the ending cleaner. I could say I opened it and found nothing. I could say I drove back and burned the hospital down. I could say I finally called the police and told the full truth about Nevada and Blackwater and every minute I had stolen from the man I left behind. None of that would be true. What happened physically is simple. I drove away from the hospital at dawn. Hours later on the coast road, I heard knocking from inside my trunk. I kept driving. I've changed in smaller ways than people expect. I don't use deadbolts unless I can see the other side of the door. I don't stand in elevators alone. I never stay on one floor of any building longer than 10 minutes if I can help it. At motels, hospitals, office towers, anywhere with long indoor corridors, I find the stairs first and keep a wedge in my pocket. A cheap rubber doorstop, bright orange, hard to lose, and at red lights, without meaning to, I still count to 30 and listen.